So we're in the midst of creating a new global outlook on the planet, the third pod from the sun, as Bucky Fuller used to say. And we all can be and have been catalysts of change. Many of us have deeply lived our own changes, but new realities of multiple people's changes is what we're trying to ascertain now for well-being of humans, well-being of the ecosystem, and well-being of the planet. So we want to, as Julia told us, deeply listen to one another, to learn the other's reality, and to respond meaningfully to those who are presenting. This is a very important part of the learning and also the process of creating this new reality. So we have Mampela, who talked to us about education and revolution. Julia, who talked to us about the deep changes in a series of cultures, particularly Bhutan. David, who told us how anguished he was with the system of economics as it drives the world. Ted, who had many, more than 50 examples of changes in communities toward the better once they got their goals lined up. And John Gilmore, who of course is working with very abused Black children in very difficult spaces in South Africa. So what we yet have to hear and share is Marilyn's telling us about the Afghan girls students, Tom Powers, who was going to tell us about his lifetime journey in making humans and small communities well, John Richardson, who has spent a great deal of time in systems which have ranged from the Dana Meadows to the Mesarovich and Barry Hughes to looking at the system of war in Sri Lanka, and yet is working on China, and myself, who's going to discuss my journey of ecosystem restoration and regeneration throughout the world. So nobody has fully developed consciousness when they're born, of course. So we're learning rapidly what other realities of consciousness expansion happen in the world. And I think as we do, we begin to have more insight into what other paradigms might be very important and how we can act as catalysts. John had a conference with some people from Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya a couple of days ago, and one of the men talked about the catalyst being bumblebees flying from crop to crop to crop, and how really charming the bumblebees were as catalysts, and we can think of ourselves as either one. So we're going to listen deeply to David Pollock, who's going to reflect on the question, and then Ted will lead us, Ted Manning, in a very good discussion of how we can move forward, which I think David has foremost in his mind. Ted?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks all for coming. And David, it's a pleasure to introduce you. I've known David for quite some time through a number of different venues. And he's one of these people who has done a great deal of stuff, and it's very useful that he is here to tell us about it. He's worked with private enterprise within the oil sector, I might note. He's worked in as running an NGO. He has been ahead of the Canadian Association of the Club of Rome. He has been working recently on an attempt to get the Canadian Association to actually define a survivable pathway out of oil or GHG consumption. And he has been working really to bring people together to try and address the current situation. I think we have all heard each other say it's not acceptable as it is. And we all have our hand, I used the image previously, one hand on the elephant, and very few of us know what the elephant really looks like. So we're asking each of you to tell us which part of the elephant we can actually take on and try and fix. And ultimately, once we piece this animal together, what on earth it's going to look like. And I'm going to give that charge to David after giving him some really haywire guidance for the next one. So David, you're on. Ask us some interesting questions.
Thanks very much, Ted. Can everyone hear me all right? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I want to say, first of all, that it's been a real privilege to connect with this group. I've been a part of several of the presentation lives. Other priorities have meant I couldn't listen live, but especially in preparing for today, I went back and I listened as carefully as I could to each of the presentations. I've been a social activist for a long time, and I've been trying to discern, is there some action that we might collectively convince ourselves was worth taking? And so this presentation is put together with that in mind. I'm trying to integrate what I've heard so far. And I think the integration begins with what we value. It's the way to approach things through primarily people's hearts, in the sense of what we care about, we will act on. And you'll see here that I will suggest it's essential for our well-being and survival that we take care of both the old wineskin and the new wine. Now, for those of you who were with us when Carlos was here, he had a lovely quip saying, "Sailing is required." It's my wife, Carolyn, and myself with our little sailboat on the Georgian Bay, the bump off of the 5 Great Lakes in Canada. And for nearly 7 generations now, we've been up on the Georgian Bay with my grandparents, great friends of the Ojibwe on Christian Island, as it has been called by the settler community. But in terms of, there's a slide that was missed. Let me see if I can find it. It didn't come in here. Yes, it's because of what Anitra said and what Julia did in her last presentation that Anitra said, now we'll all have to say what was the inner journey that brought us to our conclusions. And that's why I'm starting the way I am, to show you I was formed with this love of nature from the age of 6 months old and going back 7 generations. The opportunity to be a part of the Georgian Bay and to have a kind of a wild dream that everyone on earth might have a place where they could relax to and have a sense of safety and community and continuity was almost a boyhood feeling I had from the Georgian Bay. And in terms of formation, I was well on my way to completing a doctorate degree in modern political theory and international relations at a time when one of the great famines was hitting Bangladesh, which I later went to with an international organization. And I remember a conversation as I was taking a leave of absence from doing my PhD. My advisor had asked me to write a paper on how to unify competing theories of international relations. And I said to him, you know, we cannot unify those theories until the world itself becomes more whole, more equitable, with lower economic mountains and less deep economic valleys. And it was Mayor Brownstone, the chairman of Canada's Oxfam Canada, that said, you know, you've got 7 years to complete that ready degree. So why not go out into the world? That was many years ago. But during the course of my academic studies, I had done a thesis on the nature of stereotypes, trying to see what was left over when we had Karl Marx suggesting economic determinism and Freud suggesting unconscious impulses. What was left for the liberal Democrat in terms of rationality to make good decisions for a democracy? And it led me into a work on stereotypes, where I came to understand that one of the essences of stereotypes was the transference of understanding from one province of meaning to another province of meaning where that understanding is not applicable. We've discussed the question of beyond rationality, and Carlos has been an advocate of that. my thinking would lead us to say that there's nothing wrong with reason and rationality, but it's indeed the hubris of rationality, the misplaced faith in its exclusive use that ignores emotions, the unconscious, the intrinsic relationship to others and to nature, that we ignored our peril. There's also been some questions about those who would measure and those who would say that measurement is not of the essence. I would suggest that indeed there are times and places where measurement is highly appropriate and useful, but we need to make sure we don't mistake the singer for the song. Measuring economic factors will never fully or even closely define well-being. And one of the other reflections from the early presentations, I remember Mamfella saying, "We are poor because you are rich." And it's absolutely historically true. But then I listened to one of the interjections that Julia had made, indicating that she was finding that if we talked about genuine wealth found in relationships or happiness, that indeed it does not have to be a zero-sum game. So I took all of those as some of the starting points. When it comes to measurement, I'll just show you, I spent some time in Iqaluit with the Innu. Part of the parliamentary requirement when the land was transferred and the new territory of Nunavut was born was there had to be a report to Parliament in Canada each year on the economic well-being. They called it the well-being of the northern community. And they set up economic consultants who would go to community A and they would see there was one freezer in the ground. And then they would go to another community B where they would say there were 3 freezers in the ground, and they would conclude that community B was doing much better. Look at that wealth. Look at the fact that they have more to store. And the people that I visited in community A said, no, they didn't understand us at all. What was happening is there had been a terrible breakdown in relationships in community B, and nobody trusted each other, and they wouldn't share each other's freezers. They thought they would steal from one another. So 3 prominent families guarded the 3 different freezers. But community A, they said, was a happy, trusting, well-functioning community. And it's just an example of when we measure, we need to know what it is we're measuring. And then John, I went back and found the 1978 film that after I left and took that leave of absence to do international work, very privileged to meet with Paula Freire. This was in 1978. And although most of the copies are ensconced in libraries today, I found one online where you could see him from a film we did together called Starting from Nina. Nina was a name of a peasant's wife, and he broke into a great smile the first time he ever wrote those words. And Paulo said, that was the very beginning, his first word. And then there were other words, and they all became words of liberation. And so I put that for you, John, but he was an influence in my life as I moved into the arena of popular education. So now I want to move back to our thinking today, where I've called it well-being and survival, new wine for old wineskins. I'm going to suggest there's 4 quadrants here for the whole system, Earth well-being, that if you don't have a wineskin, you have nothing. Your liquid just disappears. And if you have no wine, there's nothing worth having, nothing pleasurable. And I've listened to the presenters where some are focused more on the wineskin, because unlike the biblical injunction that says that we shouldn't put new wine in old wineskins, we have but one planet Earth. And I take the planet Earth to be, in a sense, the wineskin. And we have a series of emergency protective actions that need to be taken. Now, of course, they would be new. They would be new grapes as well, but they're fundamentally to protect. And the way I have conceptualized it, Anitra is free to agree or disagree afterwards, but I've put energy systems as one of the key areas of protective actions that need to be taken. That's the one I'll speak more about today. And then Anitra is going to, there was a rearrangement of the timetable. And so she is going to speak about global restoration, global ecological measures. And I see that as a second emergency set of protective actions that are very much required out of climate change at the present moment. And then we had those magnificent reflections. Julia, I listened several times and really appreciated what you put together on well-being and some of the guiding philosophy that David had led off with on you can't eat money. And then in a sense of as a subset, a huge subset for the future leaders of tomorrow, the youth of today, the work that John has been doing in LEAP and the importance of transformative education from the passive to the active, engaged student. And I put the arrows there to show both of those as wine. Now, I was fortunate while at the Pembina Institute, which works primarily in the oil patch and on climate change out of the province of Alberta in Canada, to work with Mark Anielski. And the little graph in the upper right, which is multicolored, is something that we did in terms of a wheel of genuine progress indicators, we called it. So that's John's that we've looked at already. And that's part of what Julia had done for us in her presentation of well-being in life, the exercise we did. This is the one yet to come with Anitra's work. Because it hasn't been presented, she sent me some early slides that make this point about, I mean, in terms of crisis, the limited amount, 15% of the original forestry of terrestrial systems remains intact. And then in terms of getting a handle on where most of the action has to come, those top 5 countries. And then Anitra, I did a little thing, a counting exercise. If you look at 1031 on September 30th, you'll see that the number of hectares that have been cut down or burned this year ends with 806. And 2 minutes later, it's 817. So you can see 20,873,817 hectares of forest cut in 2 minutes, which suggests the kind of crisis that we do face, especially knowing how much those are carbon sinks. So what I'd promised to try to do today was to look at some aligning of policy globally and in individual countries to align with the common good. At the end, I'd like to ask you about an action proposal. I'll go back because I've done some work on this well-being genuine progress indicators. Julia had referenced Robert Kennedy, and it's really quite well known now. I think it was 1968. Basically making the point that all the important things are left out when we're counting GDP. And for those of you that don't think about GDP very much, you'll note the irony that it's just the flow of money. So when you have a terrible hurricane or an increase in cancer, any of those regrettable costs, they're all included as a positive in the GDP. It also violates the first rule of accounting. We don't subtract. We don't reduce our inventory of natural capital. We just show the dollars that have flowed. Whereas the genuine progress indicator that Mark was working on in Canada with others, it takes away those costs, those regrettable flows of money, but it does add in positive things such as unpaid work and volunteering and elder care and so on. And the question we asked some years ago was, how sustainable really is this province in Alberta with all of its oil that the premiers kept touting as the Alberta advantage, as the best place in Canada to live? And we took 51 different indicators, economic, social, and environmental. And we got the best statistics we could on those. And we created a wheel that shows at a point in time. And what's useful is to compare what's happening in this year and then another year and then a subsequent year. You can zero in on what is more positive and what is more disastrous or difficult. At a global level, of course, the pieces that are around poverty and income distribution are certainly some of the key variables that need to be watched. This was simply the ones we had laid out because we could get good data for 52 indicators Some of them are ecological. You'll see fish and wildlife and parks and wilderness. And others of them have to do with volunteerism, household work, and paid time. So each scale is different, but at its best, it fills out the circle with color, and at its worst, it becomes hardly any color at all. And therefore, it's more useful to compare year over year. But the other thing it did is it showed what happened when you compared one area over time, or in a particular snapshot of time, what was happening with the gross domestic product measured in traditional ways with the GPI, the genuine progress indicator, somewhat similar to the happiness ones. What I find interesting, though, was the move toward to work with the indigenous, where you will see a wheel that looks at 4 outward factors, or if you start at the inside of the wheel with emotional, physical, spiritual, mental, moving to wisdom, community, relationships, respect, family, community, nations of indigenous, and land. And Mark started to do work. So this is quite a recent one I was not a part of, but Mark kindly lent these to me, of a Cree Nation in Manitoba. And what is interesting here, it may be hard for you to read, but if you start at the very top where it says happiness, the most important thing is these are not imposed without. These are not the objective measurement of the economist trying to measure the value of the freezer. Each of these indicators were decided as important things to measure by community members that took part in the exercise themselves. And so if you start at happiness and work your way counterclockwise, think of Julia's presentation and listen to these words: happiness, trust of local businesses, trust of work colleagues, relationship with neighbors, relationship with friends, relationships with extended family, immediate family, trust in the community, belonging to the community, feeling safe walking at night, and then away up in the spiritual end, hope, joy, soul peace, spiritual well-being. And so it gives a great sense of empowerment to that community when they finished this exercise and went to the chiefs and said, look how low we are on some of these things, such as sports and recreational facilities. And it helped them shape some local policy, for one thing. But I wanted to show you, so that's how they divided it up. They had measurement for each of those areas of spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional well-being. And when they tried to do a comparative piece that Mark put together, he found that in terms of the happiness index, when they're doing that nations comparative, at least in 2019, that this little group of Cree within the Canadian context featured higher than Canada itself and really had done quite well in terms of all of the nations. So the point that we felt was important here is that we should try in local communities and wider communities to value and make visible to all what people value. It's one of the things then that you can use to advocate for well-being. Coming back now to the quadrant that had energy, piece of work that Ted and I have done together focuses on the questions around energy. And that's what I want to dwell on before I come to an action proposal. This is a picture of I think the world's first freestanding carbon capture machine to remove carbon from the air directly. What we did in Canada under our K-Core is we asked this question about, can Canada and Canadians conquer the climate change challenge? And we can ask the question, and countries are asking it globally as well. This is because we looked at Canada's track record, and you can see how dismally far away we are from every single target that we set to reduce greenhouse gases since 1988. And we asked ourselves, why is that so? Is it just mismanagement? Is it lack of sincerity? Is it competing interest groups? But we actually had access to a wonderful database that looked at the infrastructure that existed in Canada And we asked a bunch of questions in our modeling about what if we did a lot of good things in terms of insulation and heating systems for residences, commercial, industry. What if we electrified most of our transportation and cleaned the production of our grid? What would happen in Canada? And we can see that the target we had accepted was to bring ourselves down to 493 megatons. But in fact, we would not get there unless we began to phase out the oil sands, and clearly to the target of 141 by 2050. We would have to phase out natural gas. And it would even, we looked at different immigration assumptions, whether it would be higher or lower. But you can see how strenuous it is in Canada. But what we had done is we modeled the actual infrastructure with very robust assumptions. And we found that what Canada has done, and we think many other countries too, have primarily set targets in terms of policy prescriptions. But it's also often been in the absence of understanding, and this is the important point, physically coherent pathways from current high emitting activities to those that would be low or non-emitting. And if you don't have that, it's not possible to know what progress is actually being made. You can't set milestones along the way and adjust your programs. By the time it becomes clear that you've missed a target, it's too late because you haven't taken the time to understand how many cars you actually buy in a province and how far they go and how many tons of gases do they emit from each particular part of industry and residence. And what we believe is vital in the case of Canada is to use a modeling method which uses a technologically coherent simulation model. And we would urge that on countries around the world, that an awful lot of the modeling is done on the assumption that you can simply adjust the price of carbon and get the result you want. So we think that the conclusions of the study KCOR has been working on with hundreds of thousands of data points in this very robust database, we know that it's failed to meet emission targets and it continues on track to continue to meet those. We think the same could be said for global policy. We think the same could be said for global policy, that it's an illusion that targets set for many decades into the future can be met primarily by incentivizing citizens and businesses to take actions, and that such actions can be financed by private investors and commercial lenders. We find it's far too late for that and is going to require very good societal planning. In a democracy, you're going to have enough players on side to get these fundamental changes. So we need to engage all stakeholders. And the key thing is we need to find biophysically and technologically coherent pathways with regular milestones, and then governments can adapt their policy as we go. And our sad conclusion in the case of the traditional economy in Alberta is that we never will be able to meet our commitments as long as we continue huge production of quantities of oil and gas. It just will not add up. And the same could be said for the global community. We think a new approach is needed. We believe an arm's length agency from government, which citizens can get access to collect the data that's necessary so we can develop all of these exploratory simulation models, make them freely accessible to all stakeholders so they can make choices in terms of what pathway they wish to pursue. Because the modeling will allow you to say, what if we did this? How many megatons of greenhouse gas would that reduce? Or what if we took this option instead? Or what combination? So again, we think that this is not valid just for Canada, but to take a look at the fact that it's not just about this price for carbon on market forces. It's going to require globally and in Canada changing our paths of social and economic development. It's going to involve the entire economy, all the extraction and processing of primary resources, commerce, trade, and the behavior of consumers. These emissions are embedded in all of our physical stocks of our plant and our equipment and our pipelines and our utilities and our buildings that have taken substantial investments and last for many decades. The reason we think it's useful internationally is here's a headline from an environmental organization when Iceland first came out, celebrating the fact that this carbon capture machine would capture 800 cars emissions, 500 tons, they said, with an exclamation mark. To which another more sober publication said, this first and biggest removal plant just opened. In 1 year, it'll negate just 3 seconds worth of global emissions. At the present price, it cost the plant between $10 and $15 million. It would actually cost more than $105 trillion to create the number of plants that would remove global emissions for just 1 year. I'll give one other example, that in Germany, for example, in North America, most of us celebrated the fact that Germany had set an exit date and made a plan to help coal communities survive, to exit coal. But then, if we look now, this article just a few days ago when Merkel had left her position in Germany, the article argues Germany's been left vulnerable. If you read for yourselves here, so planning an exit from nuclear and planning an exit from coal-fired and putting the focus on energy, wind energy and solar, most environmentalists, myself included on the surface, would applaud that. But now we can see the plan has not been fully or yet successful. The article says it's failed. But what we are finding now, that there is some genuine energy crisis in parts of Europe. And that wind has only been about 10% instead of 30% as normal. So it's now having, Germany, we're speaking about, is now having to ramp up its coal-fired plants. And their electricity generation is up 28%, and the second half may see even more. So I'm simply trying to make one point here, is that if all of us had used technologically coherent simulation models, we'd be much further ahead and be far less likely to make such serious mistakes as we try to enter into any energy transition. So back again to what I think needs to be done, where we come together from our different experiences around the things we value. And I think it's imperative that while our own research and work may be in one quadrant versus another, that collectively we agree that all 4 of these quadrants are required to both protect and maintain the only wineskin we have. And we need the creativity to bring new life and new ways of working and cooperating into existence. And so I have 3 kind of pledges I want you to consider, and I'll just take a moment here. I'm very near the end, but these are not just any kind of pledge. I think that the Club of Rome, with its global outreach, could organize itself to launch a pledge among organizations and networks where they are committed to transforming global systems and societies toward a regenerative planet with societies characterized by well-being, not consumption. So the first pledge would be to organizations. The second pledge would be a citizens pledge to dedicate efforts toward global well-being. The third pledge, at the right point, we would send this out to all decision makers that we could. And the pledge itself, we would call on our members. I know people have tended to be individualistic and work often in silos around the world. We try to come together in hubs, in our national associations, in different groupings. But the idea would be that in the pledge, we would call on every member of the Club of Rome and the member of every national association to identify and share with their networks a set of online videos. And we've got most of the material in some of the presentations already, describing Ubuntu and well-being, regenerative policies and activities, and emergency protective opportunities in the energy system. And we would ask people to further beyond their networks to take the individual effort to reach out to another 100 individuals after signing the Citizens Pledge themselves, and to commit to contacting 20 elected officials during the coming year to discuss and advocate for the transformation called for in this well-being set of video package. And we would ask every member to discuss within their own organization how to respond, and each member to direct all citizen pledges to be forwarded to a central point for presentations to the United Nations. The pledge would have two parts to it, or it's just on 2 slides. You would sign the pledge. You would take time to view and discuss the Corps' video package on well-being. You would take time to commit and read the pamphlet called Emergency Protective Actions that some of us would prepare. You would take time to read and take action on some of the regenerative strategies in the pamphlet that some of us would prepare. You would also communicate with teachers, school boards, or other educational institutions and funders to share insights about transformative education models from passive learner to active agent, as described in the brand new, yet to be completed core pamphlet, The Transformative Education Leap, and other resources. And finally, you would pledge to dedicate yourself to the message that well-being lies in relationships and not consumption after basic needs are met, and strive to implement ideas and practices outlined in the core pamphlet entitled on my working slide, Well-Being, Inner Transformation, Regeneration Towards Sustainability. You Can't Eat Money, coming from one of the presentations. What we would need to have is a lead person to prepare each of the pamphlets, working with a few others from this group or recruited from elsewhere. And then there would be breaking news at the right point in time where these pledges were presented both to the United Nations and to national leaders, hoping that, advocating that fresh commitments would be made to align education, well-being, energy systems, and regenerative policies. So we would try to give a nudge to the curve of history with our limited resources, but with perhaps very significant outreach of every member connected with every one of their networks. And so the fundamental question I leave you with for our discussion today is, could we, should we try to make something like this happen? Thanks very much for your time.
Bravo.
Thank you very much, David. Sorry, I was too busy listening
Ted?
to unmute myself. So David has essentially said, get off your duff and do something. And I'm kind of with that. But I think the tactics thing too is definitely worth us discussing. That we've been talking for a long time about why we think it's not going as well as it should, why we're consuming too much, why we're not listening. And the one that really resonates with me is why we're not listening. That we've had a lot of very, very positive presentations here that people ought to be listening. And just to reflect a little bit further, we even had a plaintive essay that some of us had a chance to look at from Dennis Meadows, saying it's all been a waste. Why have we bothered? And so many other people who are in our loop are not feeling happy. We can turn on the television and we then turn it off very quickly, because it's rather clear that however good work we have been doing, it has not caused the right people to change their minds and actually alter their behaviors. So I'm going to thank David for aiming us this way, and I'm going to open it to you folks, because I want to know what we actually do next. I mean, we've been producing a rather nice dialogue amongst us. And it's clear that some of the actions, some of the things other people are doing are really not totally consistent with the notion of either economic or human well-being. And I don't know about you, but I get rather distressed just watching the news, even if it's not about the climate change, it's about the COVID, it's about the way people treat each other. So my question back to you, David, first is why the heck aren't they listening? David, are you there?
There we go. Well, Ted, I think that there's many, many answers for that. And I think we do have to put it in the context that there are millions and millions of people who, in fact, are listening.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the ones that govern the nations and that hold the strings of power in terms of businesses. So that in any social change, in my experience, you need to gather up what we could call the new powers, the powers that are willing and supportive of making change, or to those who are willing to be convinced of change being necessary. But you are always going to have some kinds of struggle. I remember being called part of the lunatic fringe when we were calling for an end to Canadian bank loans to the government of South Africa under apartheid. And it took about 4 years before the same things we were calling for became the serious proposals of diplomats and members of External Affairs Department. So I think there are people and groupings, but you need to gather them together, which is why these may sound terribly ambitious, and there's lots of work going on, but an organization like ours, that's why I'm saying if we did 3 things, a series of coherent videos, we've got them nearly put together here already, a series of pamphlets, and the launching of some pledges. With social media today, you never know what will take off. And if some of that takes off, it begins to increase the pressure for those that want change. And if at the same time we're working away in our own little sandboxes, trying to do better education work or trying to make changes in consumer lifestyles and so on. So I don't want to conclude with you that people are not listening. Some of it is motivated by fear. I mean, when you look at the number of forest fires now, if I just go to North America, and the amount of flood damage and the intensity of hurricanes, all of those things are changing the mindset to some degree of people. But the more we can harness this into a channel that leaders can't help, decision makers can't help but hearing, I think it's important. But I wouldn't want to downplay. I mean, the real challenge is the limited amount of time we have for the kind of existential crisis we face. But I certainly wouldn't want to downplay the fact that a lot of people are very committed and are listening.
Is the Club of Rome, and ask a couple of the other of you, is the Club of Rome a willing vehicle to take fairly solid initiatives forward of this genre, to take recommendations forward, to support others, or to lead the charge? Don't all talk at once. John, if you're going to talk, put your
yeah. Could I say 2 things? The one is, thank you. Firstly, thank you, David, and thank you for the work you did in raising the consciousness about South Africa's horrible history at the right time, and for bringing that into this conversation to illustrate how you have to begin. You have to begin, and you have to be called you have to find yourself in the so-called lunatic fringe initially, because all change begins on the periphery, and it's the core that comes later. And I guess that's what you're confronting us with today. I do think that the nature of the pledge is quite important, because the reality is that if we separate out the global inequity from the energy challenges, we lose a lot of the world. We have to integrate. The pledge has to be to a wellness pledge, and it has to go to the wellness that includes these elements. So I would think a lot of attention would have to go to getting that pledge to be as inclusive and as challenging and as revolutionary, if you like, as it needs to be. And the last thing really is, I don't think any organization is perfectly positioned for doing this. But I think that the Club of Rome has, and that's what you're implying in your presentation, has a degree of strange connectedness across cross-cutting spectrums of agencies and organizations. And so why not? You know, I'm also responding to a call to action at this point, because I'd rather be putting something in front of people to which they can react than just hold up the mirror that says we've got to do something.
Yeah, David, you've been really brave, taking the first step, putting the first stuff out visibly, and I will thank you for that. Who would like to respond to John or to David?
Could I make one
Go.
reference back to John, because I agree
Yeah.
with him entirely, John. What I was finding somewhat challenging is listening to, for example, a presentation like the one that Bill Reese did, where the stress was really fundamentally on the disastrous state of affairs that we found ourselves in. And then the sharp contrast when we're listening to a presentation about well-being and looking at happiness indicators. And so I was trying to integrate the presentations, you know, in terms of the 4 quadrants. But when it comes to the careful drafting of a pledge that could call for people's attention and support, I think the notion of calling for people, calling them into life, into something better, as opposed to stressing, you know, what you may be leaving behind. I'm entirely in agreement that the well-being and the wording of the kind of pledge that we launched, that would be very significant. And I really wasn't trying to do a finished job so much as just get the notion out there. So I'm in fundamental agreement with you, John, about that. But the actions, the protective actions, need to be part and parcel of what urgently have to be done.
Herbert, would you like to be next?
Yes, I would like to say a few things. We had a executive committee meeting yesterday of the Club of Rome in the run-up to the AGM, which will be in a couple of weeks' time, but also thinking ahead to next year when we when we have the anniversary of the publication of Limits to Growth 50 years ago. So certainly the kind of question of what comes next for the Club of Rome is obviously the sort of central question that comes up in any one of these meetings. And so certainly the concept of regeneration has become very central to all of what we're talking about. So that's very encouraging. Yeah. But then the question is, what next? Because regeneration is all very well, but I mean, the scale of what needs to be regenerated, particularly when it comes to ecosystems regeneration, is vast. And currently monies are still flowing in exactly the wrong direction. So unless we can change money flows dramatically towards regenerative systems of all kinds, whether it's marine, whether it's forest ecosystems, whether it's soil regeneration, all of that needs to be so central to everything that we do. So that is the huge challenge that we are really not getting to grips with at the present time. And that, of course, also relates to the question who we are. I mean, we cannot claim to be tribal people. Let's face it, we have become totally different creatures. I use a term called the amplified man. Basically, we're amplified through all types of technologies, particularly arising out of what has happened 250 years ago in the Industrial Revolution. But of course, fossil fuels being the underlying sort of primary issue in that context. So typically now, I mean, when you go back to Buckminster Fuller, he first came up with the term of energy slaves. And that term was kind of picked up by other people like Hans-Peter Dürr in Germany. You know, we are using currently per capita some 6,000 kilowatts of energy in fossil fuel energy, some nuclear, of course, as well. Whereas our bodies actually produce maybe about 100 watts of energy. So we have 600 energy slaves working for us day and night. And that obviously, that dependence on fossil fuels on a daily basis in all aspects of our ways of life is the critical issue, I think, ultimately, in terms of scaling back to something where humanity can live at peace with nature. So it's an extraordinary challenge that we're facing. Now, I mean, there's been any amount of discussion on the issue of energy efficiency and speeding up of renewables and all the rest of it, and energy storage systems. All of that clearly is underway. But until business and the financial system is willing to move in that type of direction as its primary move, its primary initiative, we are really going to carry on with this collision course between humanity and the global environment. So, I mean, I think in positive terms, I mean, the most hopeful sign that we are seeing now are the voices of young people. I also work not just with the Club of Rome, but also with the World Future Council. And there we have tried over the last few years to kind of amplify the voices of future generations. But they don't even need that amplification any longer because they're speaking for themselves. Greta Thunberg, of course, being the primary example of that. So certainly, you know, and there's an interesting collaboration, by the way, developing in the UK between some very young people like that and some very old people like David Attenborough, the famous TV presenter, who's also now working with the royal family, actually. So we'll see what happens out of all that, you know, kind of collaboration. But certainly with global get together, you know, with COP26 happening in just a couple of weeks here in the UK, we will see whether or not a challenge to the fundamental principles of what came out of the Industrial Revolution, you know, whether that will really come as a central argument in these gatherings over the coming weeks and months remains to be seen. Certainly, I mean, I think we need to go right to the heart of the matter and really begin to put the Industrial Revolution on trial itself in terms of what it's done to us, in terms of the huge acceleration of every aspect of human presence on this planet, including the amplification via technology. All of this, I think, needs to be rethought in a very profound, fundamental sort of way. And certainly the question of what well-being means in terms of restoring relationships rather than money flows. These are the kind of critical issues today, and whether we can put all that back in the, you know, the genie back in some sort of bottle remains to be seen. Certainly Dennis Meadows doesn't seem to think so. He reckons we are on a deep, slippery slope that cannot be reversed, but let's hope that's not the case. Anyway, enough from me.
Actually, Herbert, I want to ask you one other thing. You've very clearly identified the areas of intervention, which certainly based on the hubs and many of the discussions that we've been having are there. Do you think the club is going to be visible as in supporting some of the stuff at COP26, or are we going? I know Sandrine's going to be talking to them, but what else?
Well, Sandrine is not very positive or optimistic about what she can ultimately do there. And I think we should not overstate the potential influence of the Club of Rome really at this stage. I mean, I think we are, you know, too distant from policymakers, even though Sandrine herself is quite well connected with, you know, the European Union, but by and large, beyond the European Union, there's not that much influence at this stage. I don't know whether anybody in the Club of Rome is talking to the Biden administration or to I mean, we have some impact on China, I think, through some of the members of the executive committee. That's true, maybe a little bit in Japan as well. But, you know, beyond that, I mean, we have very little influence in Russia, for instance, I would say. So, you know, we can only try our best.
Fair enough. Thank you. And Anitra, I think you're logically next to follow up with the biophysical.
Yes, I think that one of the basic problems is that mankind, and I say man in a very specific way, I'm not saying womankind, I'm saying mankind, has lost its vision of where they are in this pod number 3 from the sun. And this is spurred on by things like Genesis, which says God spoke to man and then created all these animals, which man was able to name, and then took a rib out of Adam and created woman. But we've had decades of our members, Elizabeth and David Dodson Gray, Dr. Thomas Berry, Reverend Dr. Thomas Berry, who have gone into this and showed what a bad vision man has, that he thinks he's dominant in a pyramid on the top, whereas without the services of the ecosystem, such as producing oxygen, how long does anybody think that they would live? 5 minutes? As a cave diver, I can tell you that it's only a couple minutes and then you're gone. And we've gotten rid of 85% of our plants. So what are we going to do? Get rid of the other 15% and then we won't have any more plants to give us oxygen? So we don't see ourselves in the flow of the other living things on this pod number 3 from the sun. And if we were to reorder our minds in seeing where we are, one of these organisms, but can create, can love, can analyze, can change things, but still we're just another one of these organisms, just as the plants are there every day giving us oxygen and taking in the carbon dioxide, and animals are there giving us services, and ecosystems are giving us services. But having that built in to the pledge, to me, would be extremely helpful, that the mindset of the humans who make the pledge agree to see themselves in the whole panoply of the living systems on the earth and see their place there, rather than as the masters having dominion over the other living systems as just part of the ecosystem of the living systems.
I think I detect something of an emerging consensus, which is that maybe it is worthwhile going ahead with trying to forge a pledge that has all of these elements in it and see what we can do with it. And also to deliberate whether or not how we could position that within the broader Club of Rome. So as it actually supplements the hubs and things they're trying to do. Is it a tool we want to do? Who's next?
I'd love to hear from Julia and
Yeah,
John.
I think it's your turn. You're the most realistic on this kind of stuff, I think, Julia, in terms of actually making people
And
change their
John
minds.
Richardson, I think, has something to say.
Okay, John, then you can go next, Julia.
Do you want me to go first? I'd be happy to defer to Julia because I always love to hear what she has to say.
Yeah, that's true.
No,
So
please
why
go
don't
ahead,
you go
John.
ahead, Julia?
Please go ahead, John. I think you had your hand up for a while.
Okay.
Go for it.
So,
Okay, John, I'm going to be arbitrary and say you go first. Julia will
Okay.
definitely do well next.
so
Yeah.
I don't know whether I would market this as a strategy for everyone, but I have spent a good deal of my time, although of course I've published some things, working inside of governments
Mhm.
rather than outside and looking in. And this has had a very mixed value, but I mean, some of the early work that led to the book Groping in the Dark came
Mhm.
for a seminar I gave from a series of consultations I gave with OPEC oil ministers. And then our next consulting contract was with the government of the Shah of Iran. And we implemented global modeling and were quite successful in winning some support. But unfortunately, when the Ayatollah came in, why they didn't renew our contract. And then in addition to that, I worked with the Carter administration and drafted the Carter administration agenda for following up the Global 2000 study. And actually, we were able to subterraneously get that book, get that report published by the General Accounting Office, an independent agency. And while President Reagan's administration did contact me why they didn't express much interest in the Carter administration agenda. And then I've worked with the government of Singapore and actually coached people in system dynamics in the Office of Policy Planning of the Prime Minister's office. Now, the question is there a place for this along with looking from the outside in and seeking to be a change agents from the outside, rather than doing what it takes to do anthropological field research and work on the inside, which produce some good results, and now be prepared to frown and get angry. I'm seeking inroads and making progress with the government of China. So what does this add up to? I don't know, but I think there are various paths to seeking leverage points, to use Dana's term, and for looking at, if you can do it, hopefully with some integrity, from the working your way to the inside of government, as well as working from the outside, maybe another option.
Thank you very much. I'll go next to you, Julie. I'll just make one point that the Club of Rome has hired someone to be focus on outreach, a professional
Sure.
who very in the last little while, I've spoken with her, a couple of the other ones of you who've spoken with her on opportunities and on leverage. And that's all I know, and I'm hoping that she will be able to help us to make this broader and make it more effective. Julia, it's your turn.
Thank you, Ted. And first of all, thank you, David, for really a very engaging, interesting presentation. And I know it's not easy to try to synthesize all the different viewpoints. And I liked how you laid it out in the quadrants like that. Yeah, one thing I was thinking about was how the 5 impact hubs that the Club of Rome has focused on are actually really well chosen. I don't know what the process was to get to them, but they stand alone in the sense that each of them could be seen as a kind of systems lever, and each of them has their own kind of audience and actors. So they don't overlap, and yet at the same time, they are interdependent. Each of them push key areas. And so in response to your question about a kind of pledge and something coming from the Club of Rome in that regards, it kind of feels like what I'm seeing happening since coming out of the pandemic and since we've seen repeated climate emergencies and crises erupting, is a lot of different organizations launching pledges and actions in different areas. And I think my concern is that you can get lost in a huge deluge of things which have their own supporters and petitions. So I'd be curious, and I think Sandrine is doing that. How do these 5 impact hubs map to existing kind of interventions and pledges and actions? And how can the Club of Rome support those in a very tactical way? So in some ways, not launching a new thing with a Club of Rome brand to it, but in some ways, really using the influence of the Club of Rome to support things in that area in the different ways.
Yeah,
And
we haven't really I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ted.
We have not really clarified with Carlos or Sandrine or Memphela where we fit, which hub in reality we fit in, or maybe we don't. And
I don't think we fit in the cub.
yeah. But at one point, I think we're going to have to identify ourselves somewhere if we're going to get support from them in the process.
Yeah, it feels to me like a lot of the themes we've covered around well-being and new measures would fit in the hub that is about, measuring beyond GDP.
Yeah, I
And
think
kind of
so.
Yeah.
that area, it feels very relevant.
But there's
There's some
also an
overlap.
overlap on this new civilization or new
Exactly. That's
concepts.
what I was saying. Yeah.
I mean, that's the glory of the hubs. They can be all things to all people. So it's not a bad choice of foci.
Yeah. And then the last thing that came to mind is, and it comes back to that comment about, was it David Rees' presentation?
Bill Rees.
William Rees, Bill Rees, yeah.
Yeah.
That there's a certain number of actions and decisions that will need to be made that involve voluntary changes and behaviors that we take up. And a certain number that, I don't like to use the word involuntary, but they're driven from the top down. There are going to be policy changes and decisions where we can't seem to move our behavior in the right direction fast enough, something like that. And ideally, there's a middle.
Don't raise the idea of mandates or we'll get into real trouble.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting middle ground between that, where people will embrace the involuntary or the policy changes because they see the value of them, and the policy changes make it easier to do the right thing. There's so many things where individuals can act in the right direction, but the majority of people are kind of going the opposite way, so it disappears. So crafted in the right way, a policy makes it easier for people to choose to do the right thing. So I think that's also a very interesting area to explore, because it's rational. In some ways, it's about data and research and presenting facts to people. In other ways, it's about narrative and new stories and consciousness shifts so that people want to move in that direction. So I think that's a really interesting area to explore.
Great. David may want to respond to that. And then Van, it's your turn. We want everybody to weigh in, please. David, go.
Well, just a couple of things. When I've done work, not at the international level, but at the Canadian government level in terms of policy change, I remember one day I worked with Rick George, who was the CEO of Suncor Energy, that owns a lot of the production in the oil sands, the tar sands in Canada. But we went together to lobby different cabinet ministers, 3 of them individually on one day, to get a tax credit for wind energy and for renewable energy to incentivize investment in that field. And he saw the long-term future as needing to do that. So he joined with me. And every single one of these 3 cabinet ministers, they didn't look at the content of what we were recommending at first, but they looked at the masthead to see who were members of the coalition to try to assess how much opposition there would be or who was in it. And they reckoned that there were enough players who were strange bedfellows that they thought, this will wash. And they then began to show more interest. And so I always think it's very useful to bring together, when we can, players who don't normally play very nicely in the same sandbox. And I also think from my experience in social change, that it's kind of a sterile exercise at the end to sit down and try to say, where can we have the most influence, or where does the most influence lie, working inside government or outside government? Because as I said in my comment that John referenced, you will have some people that feel they have very little influence who agitate and are often dismissed as the lunatic fringe. But when you have the power in your life through your social network to invite one of your federal or national cabinet ministers to lunch or to a face-to-face meeting, then that becomes a part of the change as well. But the people marching with placards outside his window lend more credibility perhaps to the very conversation you're having. So I thought, when Greta started her work, she had no idea what influence she would have. And I don't think that it's useful really for an organization to say how much impact can we have, so much as you do something that is within your power to do, and you work at it and you see what effect it can have. And those little pebbles we throw in the Club of Rome, just like the Canadian Association, may have very little influence globally. But when we throw those pebbles into a pond, we have no way of measuring in advance what kind of effect we can have. So I say that we live in a world now with crisis, and if it's in our power to do something, even if it's out of our comfort zones, we don't know how useful it could be. And so I think, yes, the hubs, by all means, if we can work with them, great. I'm not formally a member of the Club of Rome, just with the National Association. So I have a lot of ignorance actually about those hubs. If they can be mobilized, great. If they can't, I think that's not a reason not to act. So I'm not too worried about us having a petition get lost. I think if it's well crafted, others can pick it up. If we lose our name to it and others pick it up, that's still all right. But I think it could be an activity. I mean, I think the video conversations we've been a part of, that just creating a package of video material that goes wider and more people have access to could spin off something quite useful, which is why I linked my suggestion to a package of videos as a part of a pledge, and together with the production of some pamphlets. If we can get members of the hub to help create some of those pamphlets, I think all well and good. But I guess I'm not too worried at the moment about having too much material out there, because I think it can all lend its weight toward the kind of changes we need to see.
Thank you very much, David. Van, you're next. And Ryan, we're going to call on you after that, please. Van, we need your
I need to be unmuted. How is that?
Yes, yeah. There you go.
David, thank you so much for a very insightful talk. You covered a whole lot of bases, and a lot of people here are part of the same general thrust toward it's not mankind versus nature, it's mankind, people, humans, as part of nature. And it's not technology versus the interior life and well-being and happiness. That's one package. I've generally been a token technologist in a group that deals primarily with policy issues, and so I'm familiar with a bit of that. You have to do both. Neither one gives a complete picture of what we're dealing with in life and in planning the future. Planning is a good word. No telling whether we'll get what we want or not. So I appreciate everybody's effort, this group and others who are really taking a careful look with wisdom and compassion at what is out there to do what we've got to offer to do it. And thank you all for your contributions very much.
Thank you, Van. Ryan, you get a shot. You can be left out at the end just for running the place. It's your turn.
Well, I'm just hearing all of these great speakers over the past few sessions, and I just think back of over the many years that I lived in Latin America and how different many of those places are from the way that Americans and Europeans are used to living. You know, when I was in Haiti, most of that time I didn't have running water or electricity. And so we have the resources to take care of all of the people in the world and have a better quality of life without putting such a burden on the environment. But it's not going to be like the European or North American lifestyle that many of us are used to. And it doesn't have to be as bad as some of the people in the developing world. But I think we're probably going to have to come somewhere in between. to have a sustainable future.
I think you're very right. And in fact, a number of our speakers have definitely raised the notion of compromising our lifestyle in some very significant ways. I know that each of us, I think that we got into that a little more far when we talked about Bill Reese's approach and the notion of maybe you get your quota at birth, and if you overrun it, we're sorry, your time has run out. That I am not proposing that as a policy regulation. Anyway, are there any last comments, please, before we then sort of wrap this up? And thank our speaker, John. Thank you. You stayed awake remarkably well. It must be what hour it is in your time zone.
Not difficult in this company. I just want to throw my full weight behind David's suggestion. I think we should learn from the people who are doing software development. You know, they say put something on the shelf. Don't wait for it to be perfect. Get something on the shelf and learn from what you've done. And I think there's too much in this process of our conversations worldwide, not just in the Club of Rome, of looking for the perfect vehicle. And maybe what David is suggesting is let's be part of the current, not, you know, and contribute to that flow. Maybe we will be peripheral, but we will be part of the current. Maybe we will find ourselves in an unusual place. But what's to lose?
I think nothing ventured, nothing gained. I think everybody would agree with. The major argument I think we're going to have over the next while is just what to venture, because we're grasping around at a lot of interesting things. And we still have a hypothesis that we can make a difference, so that we know enough people, we know the right stuff. We still got to play with that a little more before it really is going to resonate. But I think that this is a very good way to make it happen.
I think one of the points is that we should get along with one another, in fact, love one another in this group, because we're all little catalysts, little bumblebees running around the place trying to make things better. Each one of us has our very deep experience, and we can, if we merge all those deep experiences into a pamphlet or into a master video or something, it should be with cooperation and accord, because that's what the next world view is going to take, instead of all this friction and difficulty and wars and so forth. So, I mean, we can have an actual process going on in doing whatever it is David or the rest of them want to do, but we should do it with full kindness, generosity, and cooperativity.
David, did you want to have a last word on this, because you started it?
Just a brief reflection about what we've seen as being powerful historically. I mean, some of you have quoted Margaret Mead's about, you know, don't ever tell me an individual can't change the world. It's always been small groups of individuals and nothing else that has. But particular kinds of individuals, I think, Ted, you'll know when I mention Gord's name from our own Canadian Club of Rome, who is a beekeeper and has refused to fly unless it's absolutely necessary, and would tell me that I must afford an electric car. And if I can't, I can content myself with my electric bicycle. And I definitely need to have an electric lawnmower. And he basically says that you lose the right to advocate for this kind of change if you do it from 30,000 feet. You know, Gandhi was one of my historical heroes because of the mesh, the integrity between his words and his life and his action. And as the Club of Rome is scattered around the world, the more that people can find people that mesh the things that they do in their lives with the words, in their minds and hearts, the better it is. And so I'm not shy of recommending to a group of people who maybe primarily in the intellectual quadrant of life, Tolstoy would have certain other kinds of activities for a healthy life, to challenge us into this activist challenge. There is all kinds of action, of course, in the academic life as we put out new thoughts and new papers. But with social media today, I'm very much with John that says, let's coordinate something. Let's test it with a few other people to see if we're the right ones or whether it resides in the hubs. But let's not get stranded by inactivity, and let's try it. Let's throw some stones, our own stones, into the pool of well-being and see what happens out of it. I'm grateful for all the thinking that's percolated into my thoughts up until today. I went back and listened to each of the presentations so far, and I found them quite remarkable as you listen to each one. And that's what inspired me really to say, if these videos are good for me, they're good for a lot of people. That's all I have to say at this point, except let's not lose this moment. Let's follow up with those who want to take an action to pull together to take the necessary next steps, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you very much, all of you. And I think, David, you would like to receive comments on that manifesto you've given us, wouldn't you? At least because that way you've done it largely your own. And I think if we can send him comments over the next week or two of anything you think needs to be added or subtracted that could help, fine, because I think we probably should talk about pulling it together over the next little while. Anybody wants in on that. So at least we have something that we know exactly what we're talking about.
Well, John, Ted, I didn't name lead 1, lead 2, and so on, but in terms of editing and putting together some video material, it strikes me that, John, of course, is tailor-made for the educational one, and that he should grab a hold of anybody that he thinks he needs to. And I would think that
I'm suggesting we go a little slower in terms of flesh it out to the point where it's clear. And then we can maybe start approaching people on it. But as I say, it came as something of news to each of the people here, and they may want to think about it a little bit, get back to you. We'll synthesize it, and then we'll see what we can take forward. And yes, I think each of us can take a look at what we could do and which chunks of them we are prepared to push. And the question I think I asked Herbert, because you're in that group, how will it be received so that at least we understand who we're selling it to if we do decide to go fairly strong with it.
Well, let's briefly, somebody briefly mentioned, there is now a communications person who's been employed by the Club of Rome. And so there is an existing video, one video on the limits to growth story.
Yeah.
But that is a 50-minute film. So there certainly hasn't been a discussion on doing short videos like this.
No, that's true.
As has been proposed by David, but you should certainly push that.
Okay, so
Thank you.
You put the wolf amongst the sheep now, David. Now we got to figure out what the sheep are going to do with it.
I'm happy to get any feedback that people would like to share, but whether the pledge goes forward or not, I think some videos are a very useful first or second step.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all. And we're going to have Thorhog, Richardson, Powers, and Herbie, Marilyn, 3 or 4 others in the next few months. So be looking off.
All right. One thing to note quickly is on the YouTube channel, many of the viewers have requested contact information for some of the speakers.